Medieval England had no indoor plumbing, no sewers, no toilet paper. And yet, for 500 years, millions of people managed perfectly fine. What they built instead tells us more about daily life than any battle or coronation. Let's start at the top, the castle. A medieval castle was home to hundreds of people at any given time. Lords, knights, servants, soldiers, cooks, stable hands, blacksmiths. All of them needed somewhere to go, every single day. The solution was called a garderobe, a small stone room built into the castle wall. It had a seat with a hole cut into it, and the hole dropped straight down the outer wall, into the moat, or into a pit below. The word garderobe literally means to guard the robe. Clothes were stored in these rooms because the smell kept moths away. Medieval people were practical in ways we don't always appreciate. The garderobe was not hidden or shameful, it was simply infrastructure. Lords used them, ladies used them, kings used them without ceremony. In the Tower of London, archaeologists have found garderobes built directly into the walls. Some faced the River Thames. The Thames received everything London produced. In larger castles, multiple garderobes were stacked vertically in the same wall shaft. Everything fell into the same channel at the bottom. Someone had to clean that channel. That job had a name, the Gong farmer. Gong farmers worked only at night. They were paid extremely well for the era. They were also forbidden from entering certain parts of towns during daylight hours. The smell followed them everywhere. It was considered part of the job. They removed the waste by hand, loaded it into carts, and took it outside the walls. That waste was then sold to farmers as fertilizer. Nothing was wasted. Outside the castle walls, 90% of medieval England lived differently. Most people were peasants. They lived in small villages of 20 to 50 families. Their homes were single-room structures shared with animals in winter. There was no garderobe, no pit, no designated space at all. The fields were the toilet, the hedgerows were the toilet, the river was the toilet. This sounds shocking to modern ears. At the time, it was simply life. Human waste went directly onto the land that grew the food that fed the village. Medieval farmers understood something modern agriculture relearned only recently. Waste returned nutrients to the soil. The cycle was continuous and intentional. Chamber pots were used inside homes at night, ceramic or wooden bowls. In the morning, the contents were thrown into the street or the garden. The phrase, "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, was shouted as a warning. In England, this became "Gardez-loo." It was heard every morning across every village. Wealthy peasants might have a small wooden outhouse at the edge of their property, a simple pit covered by a wooden seat and a roof, private, functional. The pit was dug deep enough to last several years before it needed emptying. When it filled, you dug a new one. The old one became part of the garden. Archaeologists today can identify the location of medieval outhouses precisely. The soil above old waste pits is dramatically richer in nutrients than surrounding ground. Medieval gardens that sat above these pits produced far better vegetables. The best cabbages in a medieval village often grew directly above old waste. Nobody thought about this consciously. They simply knew where the good soil was. Children in villages learned from a young age where it was acceptable to go. The rules were practical. Not near the well, not near the doorway, not upstream. Upstream and downstream determined everything about where a village was placed. Medieval London was a different problem entirely. By 1300, London had roughly 80,000 people inside its walls. 80,000 people producing waste every single day in a space of 1 square mile. The city had no central waste system, no organized collection, no plan. What it had was the Thames, open ditches called kennels running down the streets, and hope. Every house was required by law to have a cesspit beneath it. The cesspit was a stone or brick-lined pit that collected everything from above. In theory, Gong farmers emptied them regularly. In practice, they overflowed constantly. The streets of medieval London smelled in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine. Foreign visitors wrote about it repeatedly. The smell was considered a defining feature of the city. In 1326, a man named Richard the Raker fell into his own cesspit and drowned. The coroner's report survives. It describes the pit as overflowing and poorly maintained. Richard the Raker is one of the most cited people in medieval sanitation history. Public latrines existed in larger cities, long wooden benches over pits or rivers. London Bridge at its peak had a public latrine built directly over the Thames. Several dozen seats, open to anyone, in continuous use through all weather. The Thames beneath London Bridge was not a place anyone wanted to swim. Butchers added blood and offal from their shops. Tanneries added chemical waste. The river carried everything downstream to where it eventually diluted into the sea. Drinking water came from the same river, but upstream, above the city if possible. The connection between contaminated water and illness was not understood scientifically, but people noticed that those who drank from wells lived longer than those who drank river water. They didn't know why, they acted on the pattern anyway. Medieval medicine offered explanations involving bad air, miasma, not germs. The smell of waste was considered the actual cause of disease, not entirely wrong in effect. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. It killed half the population in 2 years. Medieval people blamed everything: sin, strangers, planetary alignment, bad air. Nobody identified the real cause, but the plague changed how cities thought about waste. After 1350, London began investing seriously in its water supply for the first time. New conduits brought fresh water from outside the city walls. New regulations required cesspits to be lined properly to prevent leakage. Fines for throwing waste into the street increased dramatically. Progress was slow. The smell of London remained famous for another 5 centuries, but the direction had changed. Cleanliness was becoming a civic value, not just a personal one. In castles, the garderobe remained standard until the 16th century. Henry VIII had a groom of the stool, an official royal position. This person assisted the king with his most private moments and was considered an honor. The groom of the stool was one of the most trusted people in the kingdom. Access to the king's most private moments meant access to the king himself. Political secrets were discussed in the garderobe. Decisions were made there. It was, in its way, the most important room in the palace. The first true flush toilet was designed by John Harrington in 1596 for Queen Elizabeth. She reportedly used it twice and found it too loud. The invention sat unused for nearly 200 years before being reinvented independently. The modern sewage system for London wasn't built until the 1860s. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette constructed over 1,000 miles of underground sewers after the Great Stink of 1858. The Thames had become so polluted that Parliament was forced to adjourn due to the smell. The building that hosted Parliament sat directly on the river's edge. It took the smell reaching the most powerful people in England to finally solve the problem. The medieval gong farmer and the Victorian sewer engineer solved the same problem 5 centuries apart.